Okay, well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this presentation on developing the technical excellence in the hammer. Obviously, I've done two previous presentations, one on the entry and the other on the turns. And in a way, this is a combination of those, but it's mainly aimed at understanding the technical excellence model that we've developed over recent months, with an aim to being able to develop a base level of coaching across the country. So it is absolutely based in the information that I've given out in the previous two webinars. So I hope this actually just builds on that and maybe explains some more of what we're aiming at in detail, but also gives a tool in the long run that both coaches and athletes can use to develop themselves, and particularly in order to develop themselves in a way for early throwers, novices and beginners, to do so in a way that doesn't potentially put blockages in place for later in their career. So the format of this evening is this, the agenda. Obviously, introduction is what I'm doing now. We'll talk about aims and objectives. Underlying ethos and is a really important part here. I've mentioned it in both of the previous webinars, but I will go over it again because I think it's essential. Talk about what the excellence model actually is, and then some underlying principles that are referenced in it and which I think are essential to understanding the model overall. And then we'll actually look at the model in some detail, and we will use it in action, or I will, in some comparisons, both in terms of stills, and at the end I'll run through some videos and sort of show where the stills have come from and why we've picked them out. So the aims and objectives here is obviously to understand the technical excellence model and those underlying issues of the ethos, the athletic posture and linear drive, which I've talked about in the previous webinars. But then specifically here to identify the stages of the throw that we are considering in this situation. And this is not to say that, you know, these are the only positions that you can consider. They are just ones that in working through this with other people, particularly with Tor during some recent discussions, Tor Gustafsson that is, online with him. And these are the positions that essentially we've used and he has used very clearly to identify what a good technique looks like. So those are the ones that we've incorporated into this model. It's a little different to the other throws technical excellence models in that regard, because we are talking about fixed points rather than phases of the throw, but I'll come back to that shortly. So obviously then we want to understand how we use it to score and what the purpose of that is, and then how to implement that scoring system. So the underlying ethos, I mean, in reality, this comes down to the quote in the middle of the page. You know, there are only two things that matter when you've let go of an implement. It doesn't matter whether it's a shot, discus, a dart, or whatever you feel like. The reality is that only two things really make a difference as to how far it's going to travel. That's the speed of the implement, or in this case, the hammer speed, or the angle of release and the direction of release, call it what you like. And given that most people can achieve a reasonable angle and direction of release, although we will talk a lot about that during the rest of the document, the one that really matters then is hammer speed. So, you know, what this is all about, the thing that sits underneath this again and again and again, is that what we're trying to achieve is an absolute maximum speed of release, so that the hammer is traveling at its maximum possible velocity at the point when it's let go. So that means for hammer, because it's a rotational event, essentially it's the speed of rotation times by the width of rotation. Speed of rotation is as good as and as fast as the athlete can move, and actually width of rotation is more about technique, and so we will be concentrating a lot on that. during the course of the rest of this presentation. So what is the excellence model? And please don't try and read this. This is just a view of what it looks like when it's in a Word document. Okay, all of the writing in the middle part of that document there is the detail, and I will go through that line by line throughout the rest of the presentation. Essentially, the way it works is that we aim to look at the throwers in as regards their positions, and once we're looking at that, then we measure them against the text which is on the right hand side here. In the bottom is the area where we mark them, and if they meet all of the standards that are set in the right hand side of the document at each phase, at each stage, then they get a mark, a 1 if you like, or a 0 if they don't. It's that simple. There's no 1, 2 or 3 or whatever. It's just a simple, you either do it or you don't do it. You do it all or it's marked as a 0. That may seem a bit crude, but actually it works quite well. And when you then measure the 3 points across any particular stage and phase of the throw, the result then is given as the mark, the lowest mark here. You can see the point which actually allows us to score, and we're therefore able to have an indication for athletes that we analyze using this document as to how well they're doing at that point in time. And of course, then the training, we hope to see an improvement over time of these base elements of the throw. And for that reason, it's going to be used within the talent programs that are running through England Athletics at the moment. So that's the sort of basic outline of the document. What is it really? Well, it's a tool to aid the development of excellent technique and build a sound basic model towards world-class standard. And I think that's really important to understand. I've said it already, but this is about trying to drive the Hammer event forward in this country. And we see a lot of people in this country rise well, you know, up to the 70 meters in the men, 60 meters in the women, and then they tend to get stuck somewhere in that low to mid 70s area. If they do well, they tend to push a little bit through that, maybe 75, 76. But as you well know, we have very few people capable of reaching 80 meters, which is ultimately a standard for the men, and probably 75 plus for the women. So it's important that we build a good basic technique. So we want to use this as a guide for coaches on how to do that and to spot these essential technical points within the throw, to understand and use the document in developing their own coaching strategies. So please understand, I'm not trying to tell anybody how to coach this event. I'm simply saying these are some, you know, some points that should be considered within any coaching strategy for the event. It's also a measure of technical improvement on the talent program, which I just referenced, and essentially, you know, it gives us some way of identifying what progress has been made for those athletes that do attend the talent programs. So what it's not is just as important, I think, and in a way I just implied here, it's not a style guide, and I don't mean the clothes they wear. I do mean, you know, there are many elements within a throw where people do something slightly different. They may pick their foot up slightly earlier, put it down slightly later, you know, all of these parts. And that's another reason why I don't necessarily go for phases. And there's been a significant discussion over the issue of phases and stages in the throw for that very reason. The timing can be slightly different. It's so dependent often on the physical capacities as well as the physical presence of the thrower involved. You know, are they a quick thrower, a slow thrower, a strong thrower, a tall thrower, a short thrower? They happen to have long arms or short arms or whatever. And all of these things can affect what is really style, but the underlying points remain the same. it is also not a stick to beat anyone over the head with. The fact that somebody doesn't do something in this because there is some difference in them, well, that's fine. We understand it. The point is we try to understand it. We're not trying to say you must do this exactly right as according to this rule. If we understand the reason for not doing it, that's perfectly acceptable too. So why do it? Well, again, I've already said, failures of basic technique and often lead to delayed and even capped development, as well as competitive glitches. And funnily enough, we were just talking about that a few moments ago, and I was with Craig when I met him at the weekend, how things that we learn early on in our career can frighteningly return at the moment we're most under pressure. What we sometimes see, particularly as a coach of many years myself, I can't tell you how many times I've trained with somebody and coached them into a new element of their technique, and they're doing it beautifully, and they go into their first competition, and all of a sudden it's just like their last competition of the previous year. For some reason, the brain seems to have this amazing capacity to separate out what is competitive element and competitive environment from the training environment. And there's a good reason for then building some processes into your coaching that model the training exercise. And that might mean as much as going to a different venue and doing, only allowing 2 warm-ups and then 6 throws and so on, just to try and get these new technical elements into there so that they don't suddenly go wrong when they're most needed not to go wrong. Obviously, it provides a framework within which the event can be developed over time. So it's a living document. We want to develop it. We want to move it forward. We want people to use it. So anybody here who is coaching or an athlete, please use it. And if it doesn't work for you, come back and tell me why not. And I'd be more than happy to incorporate any feedback on that. And I have already put my email into that list there, but we will provide it again if anybody wants it. It also allows for an easier exchange. It kind of gives us a base language over which to talk. And we may change that language over time. I mean, all languages develop over time. But right now, people can often find themselves saying something and then being misinterpreted simply because actually what they're trying to achieve in the event is slightly different. So if this gives us a base language with which to speak, it means that we're all trying to speak a similar language. That allows us to communicate more effectively, and that's particularly important within the community of practice that we're trying to build, which hopefully will help steer the whole event forward over time. So where's the delivery? Okay, if you were taking care to look at it, and I do appreciate it was a little bit small, you will have noticed that none of the phases or stages includes the delivery, and there's a very good reason for this. As far as I'm concerned now, and this is something that's changed for me hugely in recent years, is that I just see the delivery as an extension of the low point in the last turn. It's something that happens as a consequence of having a good throw, actually. In fact, Lucy, who I coach, she has received several contacts from very good international standard throwers asking how she achieves the delivery she does. And some of that is innate because of her physical size and so on. But actually a lot of the time it's because she's trying to get in good positions and the delivery just happens. So when we get asked what special drills we do and so on, the answer is we don't. And actually that can be quite deflating, I think, for some people. But actually that is the reality of it. And that's the reason that the delivery has not been included in these phases here. But if again you were looking, you will have noticed that actually we do include the swings. So, given the swings are a single element that happens once, why do we include them? And the simple answer is they're absolutely essential to move from the from the static position where we start with a hammer with feet still or stillish into a completely dynamic position where everything in the body and the hammer is moving and turning. And that means that, if you don't set it up right, if you don't get the swings correct, excuse me, then it can be very hard to get the entry correct, which is actually the first low point in the throw. And if the first entry is correct, almost inevitably things worsen throughout the throw. Once those positions have been achieved using the swings, then they're no longer needed. This is a one-time event within the throw, where actually each of the other stages we're going to look at repeats in the throw 3 or 4 times, or maybe 2, depending on how many turns your athlete is doing. So we come back then to understanding the underlying principles, and the first of these is athletic posture. Again, it's been talked about previously, not just by me, but by the other throws coaches as well. But fundamentally, in terms of description, the weight is between the feet, hips are rotated under the shoulders, and certainly in hammer, we tend to refer to that as posterior tilt. Shoulders are above the hips, the upper body is relaxed and held firm. So it stays in position, but it's not tense. It doesn't need to be, because it's well enough developed to be able to maintain that position without going into overload. Shoulders are level and relaxed, and the head is central and the neck relaxed. And one might add into that, possibly with the hammer, this whole thing of where the shoulders and the arms and the hammer should be, but I will come back to that as we talk about the stages of the throw. Now, what we see when that athletic posture is good is that body and the hips have a good angle on them. Here, just something over 90 degrees. But in particular, what it allows Koji here, and this is, for those who don't know, this is Koji Murafushi. He obviously a very significant thrower, having thrown well over 80 meters. And the clips that I'm using here and the film that you'll see at the end are of him throwing, I think about 81 meters in a training throw in around about 2012. And this really has been almost an ideal model. It's not perfect, there's no such thing, because people do different things in different throws on different days, and actually there's a lot of research that says that's perfectly normal. And in fact, the more advanced the thrower, the more they're able to vary and still throw a very long way, because they're so experienced in that, their bodies are so experienced, they can deal with minor variations. It doesn't create the difficulty that it does for beginners. So here, the whole point in this athletic posture is the down arrow. It's where his center of gravity is going to be, which, as you will notice, is outside his feet here, which means, in effect, at this point, if it wasn't for the hammer, if you took the hammer away, you know what had happened. He'd just fall backwards into the center of the circle. That's really important, because what that leads to is the second principle, which is one of linear drive. What we're looking to try and develop here is the concept of linear drive. So it's a rotational event, but actually we want to be driving the thrower directly across the circle from the back to the front. Yeah, it is possible to arc across in terms of the foot positions and so on, but generally, actually very good throwers who are at their peak will tend to still go straight across, and in this throw, Koji does exactly that. Some people might start further around to the right, or use a more of a step in, or all sorts of other, again, style variations, and often they're because of limitations in that individual. Injuries, particularly hip injuries, tend to cause a problem, but obviously lower back injuries or even shoulder injuries and so on and so on. All of these things can affect the way that a thrower is able to turn and the speed with which they're able to transition between certain stages in the throw, and therefore they may adjust those stages in order to be able to still maintain overall this linear drive across the circle. The important thing about it is it occurs at the low point where the hammer here, and you see in the bottom picture here, the hammer is facing directly towards the camera. It's going straight out down the middle of the sector. The drive is across the circle, absolutely in the direction of throw. You can see it requires good posture to maintain it, and if you're not sure about that, I will certainly prove that to you in the rest of the presentation. But also, it should be understood that it feels like a bit of a whoosh of acceleration through the low point. And by that, what I mean is it's not under control. It kind of, something happens and the hammer accelerates seemingly almost on its own. And by that, you're led into a position of what we call controlled imbalance. Essentially, you're throwing the hammer out there, and at that point, you're falling almost backwards across the circle. You might even increase it by driving with your legs backwards, not upwards, but backwards across the circle. But it's then dependent upon the athlete to turn and be able to get themselves back into a controlled balance position. So it's a sequence of imbalance, balance, imbalance, balance, and that is what creates the acceleration in the hammer, and in particular creates this linear drive across the circle. So here in all of the turns is that linear drive, and if we look carefully at it with the arrows put in, and please excuse the delivery one is a little bit late, the entry one's a little bit early, this is down to frame rates on cameras and so on, but you pretty much get the right idea here that this is about that drive going straight down the line of the circle, and that's the direction that the hammer ends up being thrown in. So let's move on to the swings. This is the first element. Sorry. I seem to have missed. All right, sorry, my apologies. I'm just getting myself slightly confused here. So we'll do the swings. I was anticipating something myself here, which is a little ironic given anticipation is one of the things that we're trying to avoid in the hammer here, and I'll show you why in a little while. So the first elements here, you'll notice that in the document, the excellence model, we always split things into trunk, hips and legs together, and then the arms and the implement, in which case this is the hammer. So in the swings, we're looking for the athlete to be in an athletic position, and you will see that repeats. And it is important because some athletes can hold the athletic position in one element of the throw, but not be able to hold it in others. The body is relaxed without excessive hip or body movement. You know, quite often we see beginners, particularly when they're winding up, and you see their hips moving side to side to counter the weight of the hammer. And if that's necessary because of the weight of the hammer, then I would suggest very much that the athlete needs to look at throwing something lighter. Moving your hips like that, it makes actually hitting the points after this very much more difficult. I've said here, head looking to the right, and actually you'll see with Koji, his whole body is angled towards the right. I mean, he's even got his right foot slightly back from the edge of the circle here. And again, this is a difficult position for beginners to hit because often they're already thinking about the direction of throw. And given that it's behind them, they begin to anticipate it. And it can be quite hard. And you'll see a lot of beginners start by facing the back of the circle. And essentially that cuts out the time that they have to set up the first entry. And by the time they're actually coming in with a swing and they begin to try and hit a position, the ball has actually gone past the low point, and that puts them in a difficult position right from the word go. So a turn that starts from angle to the right in terms of the trunk is very important. The legs need to be slightly flexed. They don't need to be at 90 degrees or anything. Some throwers are higher, some are lower, again, dependent on who they are. You know, we could easily find throwers who do both, who throw well over 80 meters. The weight, again, between 60-40, 40-60, so exactly where the weight is isn't too important. But if it's too much on one side or the other, then that begins to cause a problem. Both feet stable on the ground with minimum lifting of heels. In fact, Koji here does tend to lift his left heel somewhat, but again, that's more of a style issue for him and is about how he starts. He soon rectifies that as he sits into the next phase, and actually he's incredibly good at that. So if I were looking at this in terms of marking, as you'll see in due course, it would be something I would not worry about too much. The bottom one, I hope, is fairly obvious. The hammer's held softly by the gloved hand. Maybe this part not so obvious, that in fact it's the right hand for a right-handed thrower that should really be doing the grip, the one on top, not the gloved hand. It's the other hand that really holds the implement. If the gloved hand is gripping the implement too hard, then inevitably there will be a pull through the left arm, and that will upset the angle of the hammer. The forearm should be relaxed, because if they're not, it tightens up the whole body, and the hammer swung around the head in a flattish orbit where possible. Male throwers tend to throw with a wind up with a slightly higher orbit in the wind up, simply because of the weight of the implement. Ladies can usually put it in flatter, and actually that's very helpful, and I'll explain why when we come to the low point in a moment. The hammer orbit should be extended early from over the right shoulder, so there should be no sense of any bend in the hammer, and you can see when you look at that image of Koji that he has no bend and that he is in contact with that hammer, even though it's a very long way behind him, and he will be in contact with that hammer completely until it rides all the way around and into the low point. So we look at that in terms of three athletes. Obviously the image of Koji here in the top right as the advanced thrower. The top left is Lucy, my athlete and wife. So I'll be careful what I say. And at the bottom here, we have Lexi Ellis, who is a novice, who is coached by Nick, who is obviously online and watching this as well. And I guess Lexi may even be here as well, although I haven't been able to check that. So if we look at the differences here, and really there is some style differences here, actually each of them is not too bad. Lexi tends to let the hammer get a little bit further away from her head, and you'll see that hands are higher as opposed to where Koji's got his behind and very much just above his right shoulder. Lucy again tends to take it higher because she tends to keep it a little bit flatter, and again that's easier with a lighter implement to some degree. You can see the weight though, the weight for Koji here is very much between his feet. He's probably got slightly more on his right than he will have on his left, particularly at this moment in the wind-up. But when you look at Lucy, you'll see that she's leaning across to her right, which will tend to suggest that at least in the early turn she will have too much weight on the right as she enters. Whereas actually when we look at Lexi, and this would probably have been different a few months before, things have changed on account of work that she's done with Nick, you'll see that actually she's beginning to lean into her left-hand side. But in fact, if we look there at the foot, you can see, in fact, if you look at the whole foot, knee, hip complex, it's quite clear you can't have a lot of weight on that, and yet she's leaning into that side, which means that she's going to have to effectively catch that, drop the heel, and while she's doing that, sitting into the right position will actually be quite difficult. So whilst the holding of the hammer, we'll assume that they're all doing that reasonably well. Obviously we'd be able to look at that in detail if we were with the athlete, but in terms of where the trunk is, none of them is particularly bad. Koji is very much looking to the right, whereas Lucy is looking just right of the center of the back, and Lexi is kind of looking, I guess, just to the right of the center of the back as we look at the throw there. So clearly there would be some issues in those throws, and we would mark them accordingly within the document. So, and here's the bit that I was looking for. I'd got myself out of order momentarily. It's the stages of a good turn. So this is what we're going to look at for the rest of the document. There are 4 positions that we're looking at, and these are the low point, the wide point, which happens just after the right foot comes off. Usually it might, for some throwers, the right foot might even still be down at this point, which is, you know, another reason why try not to think just in terms of the traditional single support, double support. Here, bottom left, we're talking about the high point, and this image is perhaps a fraction just before the high point. I was just trying to think of a way of describing this point, really, but again, I'll come to the detail of that as we go through. And then the catch, and a very important part of that is the fact that it's the beginning of the next turn. It's not the end of the previous one. We always put it on the end, and I wish I could put it at the beginning, but obviously in the very first turn, the first thing that happens is a low point. I guess in a way the catch is nearer and equivalent to the swings, but obviously it has its differences too. So the stages of a good turn, essentially, when we're looking at the low point, it occurs at the lowest point of the orbit, so that's fairly obvious. It should be 180 degrees from the direction of throw, so dot there stands for direction of throw. And the hammer should very much be in a neutral position. So what we're looking for here, if we come down to the arms first, we're looking for relaxed and long arms forming an isosceles triangle. That's a triangle essentially where two long sides are the same and they have an equal angle to a line that would be taken directly through the shoulders. Extend that out down the hammer and you see that the hammer should effectively form a line that goes straight through the middle of that isosceles triangle. If it's off to one side or the other, and there's some good diagrams on this from the on the web. I've forgotten the website now, but it's one of the international sites actually has some very good analysis of this. And again, it shows why, if you have the hammer off to one side or the other, the effective length of the rotation there is reduced. So the orbit is going to be wide and extended. You know, it's here, it is extended towards the back of the circle. We don't want to be extended too far. We don't want to be leaning to extend that. The shoulders and everything, that athletic posture, which is the trunk element of this, is absolutely essential that it's maintained. And we don't sacrifice that athletic posture in order to create extra width towards the back. We just want it to be as wide as it can whilst maintaining that position. In particular, the head should be looking at or slightly behind the hammer. So what we mean here is that, you know, you let the hammer come past the head. In this case, the hammer could potentially rotate out to our right as we're looking at towards Koji's left, and his head stay looking in the direction of the camera. Anywhere around there is fine. Leading in with the head, looking over the left shoulder, all sorts of things that happen at this point, much more difficult and create their own problems. In terms of the hips and legs, the athlete sits into a firm left hip, because what we want to see is the rest of this turn and each of the subsequent turns rotates around a point around about the left hip. And when their heel turns, it essentially extends up through the back of the left shoulder. When its toe turns, which actually this is for Koji in his very first turn, then the point of turn is actually in front of the left shoulder. So the athletes sit into a firm left hip, but they also keep the right hip held back. And here you can see that position very clearly. Koji's not rushing, he's not turning his right foot and his right knee in to try and push his right knee forwards. He's allowing his right knee, in fact, he's holding it, actively holding it back. That was one of the things that he was actively trying to do at this stage in his career, and felt that it gave him a much greater orbit of the hammer throughout the rest of the throw. His weight here is very evenly balanced, and whilst that will shift as he moves through the throw a little bit, as will the low point a little bit, the whole system can then turn together and work the hammer right through the wide point and then eventually out into the high point. What does that look like as we move through the throws? Well, there it is again. And of course, it is that linear drive because we're talking about the low point here. And you can see how in turn 1, we've just seen that one. Turn 2, it's very similar. Turn 3, he's just beginning to lean a little bit on his right. Hey, he's moving at great speed by now. Turn 4, he actually hits the position maybe slightly better. So that might just be a frame rate issue there. And in the delivery, again, he's absolutely banged down the middle. And that low point has come through. And again, it's probably just a frame rate issue that it's gone past. But actually, just from the inclination of his body in this particular frame, you can see that he's still heading out and down the middle of the sector. What does that look like in our 3 athletes? Well, there we go. There's a position from Koji I've already described. When you look at that in terms of Lucy, and I didn't say, but this throw that you're looking at from Lucy is a competitive throw. It's a 59-meter throw, which was close to PB at that stage, may even been a PB if I remember rightly. She did then throw 56 some weeks after this, so she was in pretty good form. But you can see how her head is looking well ahead of the hammer, very much out to the right of the picture as we look at it. Her arms are well extended, the shoulders and that, but if you look at the line through the hammer, it actually pretty much goes up through her left shoulder, not up through the middle, which is showing you that there's some loss of radius there. And also, if you look at where the hips, her back, a line through her hips, if you took a perpendicular to that, it's actually beginning to point out to the left-hand side of the sector. Now, if she'd carried on like that, and one of Lucy's issues through some throws is that she will tend to throw even hooks slightly outside of the left sector. And this is why, if she doesn't correct this in the rest of the throw, then that hammer's absolutely going out down the left-hand sector. In terms of Lexi, because she's learned to begin throwing the hammer out to her left, she's now putting herself in a much better position, a weight much more between the legs. There's a little bit on her left-hand side, which is fine, the 60-40 working in here. But you can see also the hammer is very much more along her left arm. And in fact, if you look at her right arm, it even looks like it's slightly bent and turned under. One way of dealing with that sometimes for beginners, you can actually ask them to put the non-glove hand on top to rotate that whole system so that the right hand for a right-handed thrower is in top rather than the gloved hand being on the top. That can help straighten the arms out. But there we go. We can see that head's gone. The hammer's in slightly the wrong place here, albeit that the weight is pretty good. It also looks like she's leaning forward a little bit. Lucy does lean forward, but she counters that by sticking her bum out. Actually, her hips and all of that drop back and do lead out towards the left side. So her drive is beginning to go out down the left-hand sector. So the wide point, right foot off here. You can see it in Koji's position. It's 90 degrees roughly from the direction of throw. It is the point where we're trying to get the hammer out to the widest point, and for a right-handed thrower, obviously it's off to our right, his left. The trunk's still in an athletic position. You can see here he's got his trunk almost vertical. That angle that we saw between his trunk and his legs has been maintained. He's not going up, he's not going down. And the head is still facing towards the hammer. The shoulders are level and near parallel to the ground. So if you took a line through his shoulders out towards the sector line there, you'd find that that was very near to parallel to the ground. The body hammer complexes are all rotated together. There's no sign of him trying to lead it into that position. His athletic position is maintained as he's done that, and the hips are at a consistent height, so he's not bouncing. We see so many times people bouncing the hammer at this point. They're either lifting it or they're lifting their shoulders and then bouncing it up in the air. And all of that creates extra movement in the hammer, which is neither helpful from the point of view of maintaining consistent technique or for creating acceleration. The trouble is, for athletes, it feels like it creates acceleration, but what's actually happening is the hammer is slowing down. The hammer orbit is extended and passive with full rotation through to the high point. So we can see how the movement is as wide as it can be, and it will push through to the wide point that we'll come to in a moment or two. So the wide point here, in terms of each turn, we can see it developing. The one area that does change is how far forward his hips are in each, but that athletic positioning is relative to where he is. So if you take a line through from his feet up through hips and shoulders, then actually these things stay fairly similar. The reason for the lean, as much as anything, is because he's getting his hips further forward to allow him to catch more effectively once he's gone through the high point. It allows him to get the hammer up into the high point, and also he will be able to catch with more of his weight on the left-hand side. If we look at this in comparison with the athletes here, and you can see again Lucy is well back off that. Her hips are back, her arms are long and extended. In fact, they've all managed that pretty well, but there is a sign of Lucy having lifted here a little bit. If you look at the angle of her arms, the hammer is actually slightly below the angle that would run straight through her arms here. Lexi and Koji slightly better with that. Lucy clearly has some effort, momentum that's moving out to the left of the sector, because she's not maintained that position as she's turned, but it is a very long position, so there is some advantage in that. Lexi, on the other hand, she has managed that position, but her athletic position has dissolved slightly. You can see that there's something of an arch in her back. You only have to look at the creases in her top to understand that there's an arch that's happened there. And essentially, she's used the arch in her back to try and balance herself out. And so that's a loss of the athletic position. They've all managed to keep the shoulders level relative to the ground, so actually those are all good points, but as we can see with both Lexi and with Lucy, there are some errors at that situation. So here we're into the high point, and again now the trunking is in athletic position with some lean back to balance the hammer. I mean, there was some lean back clearly in the wide point as well, but it happens even more so at the high point. And in a sense here, what we're looking for is exactly that. It is a balance between the athlete and the hammer. I think Sean Pickering said recently, it's a battle between thrower and implement, but it's a battle that neither wants to win. You know, at this point in it, you have to be in balance, because between here and the next position is a very passive phase, really. Your feet are going to try and move into a good position, but the hammer is effectively pulling you through this position. For that reason, it's important that the athletic position is held, that the lean back is balancing it out, the head's still looking towards the hammer. The right knee is thrust forward here, so very important. What we often see is that knees stay together, and that actually prevents the movement of the hips forwards, and therefore the balance of the hammer is not effective. And the right foot needs to be close to the right shin. The arms here are extended and passive. The arms are at less than 90 degrees to the body. And this is something that we see quite often when people are trying to achieve the high point. They reach up and their arms are actually above 90 degrees. Why is that an issue? Well, if you ever try doing push press or press behind neck or lifting or doing overhead squats, you soon find out what it's like to have your arms extended above your head. It actually is quite a weak position. When you can get your hips forward and lean back into that throw, your arms don't need to rise much above 90 degrees, if at all. And it's a much stronger position, which allows you to stay in position without being tense. What does that look like throughout the whole throw? Pretty similar, okay? And it's only in the very last turn, really, here, turn 4, that we see that Koji's arms have risen more above 90 degrees. He's turned a little bit further in each one of these, and again, that's a very good sign that the orbit is growing, the whole throw is developing very nicely. Compare that to our three athletes, and we can see the difference in position here. Here we're really starting to see a significant difference with Lucy. She's leaning forward into this throw considerably more. It looks like maybe this frame is slightly further ahead than Koji's, but actually her knee is driving across and around, not up, and therefore instead of being next to her shin, her foot is actually next to her other foot. That's true also of Lexi to a degree. You can see her foot is considerably lower. If for each of these, this is the first turn. So, you know, that needs to come up. The knee needs to drive up in order to push the hips forward. Again, you can see that Lexi has a bit more arch in her back in this position, so the athletic position is being lost. And there's also a sign here for Lexi that there's a bit of a bend in the wire of the hammer. That might just be that it was a bent wire, but actually there's a sense that she's lifting and the hammer is delayed rather than the hammer leading the way here, which it certainly is for the other two athletes. So we look then at the catch here. The catch of the throw is, as I've said, very much the start of the next turn. So we must look at it in that way and think about it in that way. It occurs 45 degrees roughly, somewhere. Again, that will change through each turn past the direction of throw, but it's definitely outside of the left sector line. The trunk now very much in that athletic position. You will see a slight forward incline, yes, but Koji's weight here very much back over his left side. And that gives this what sometimes people talk about as a scooter or roundabout effect. You know, it's like being on a roundabout and the right leg is just a one on the ground that's pushing the floor away, pushing it around so that the rest of this complex, the body with the hammer, can all rotate as quickly as possible. Looking at the hammer, he's keeping that hammer out as wide as possible, and he's not trying to get ahead of it. The right foot touches down near 270, so it's facing away across at around about 90 degrees out to the left, 270 in terms of the full rotation. And his whole body now is pointing out to our left as we look at this photograph. The weight's mainly on his left side. Both feet then rotate immediately together in the direction of throw. And actually, you might even anticipate this a little bit. From a thrower's perspective, it might feel like an anticipation simply because, you know, it takes a fraction of a second between the brain receiving the information and then turning. So there has to be a fraction of anticipation here for the timing to work right. But it's a very, very much a timing-based issue. The arms remain extended and passive, and everything rotates together towards the body back into the low point. What does that look like in terms of each turn? There we go. You can see it developing. He does rise over the course of the throw slightly, but very little. Actually, there was a point in the high point there too where we shouldn't see him rising, and he doesn't. So it's something that we haven't really expressly put in, simply because we don't expect to see it. It's not something we're looking to happen. We want to see the athlete staying pretty stable in terms of height right throughout each turn and right throughout the throw. If we look at the difference again here, we can see how it's being caught in a different position. Koji, very stable, very much weight back on the left-hand side. Lucy catches, she does tend to turn as actually more like beginners do tend to turn, very much as though she's trying to get her feet back in the direction where she started, facing the back of the circle. But also she tends to anticipate the turn with her left leg. I used to believe that this was something that ladies did and that it was a peculiarity of female throwers in the hammer, until more recently I've seen more than one, at least one of whom is here this evening, or was, thrower doing that. I think, it's just a personal opinion, that this comes at least partly from trying to anticipate the turn and begin the turn before the hammer is in the right place to do so. So that horrible twist of the knee and the foot it really does look uncomfortable, and it doesn't perhaps surprise you to know that Lucy does have some trouble with that left knee. We've worked on trying to put that in a better position over more recent time, and that has reduced it to some degree. But Lucy's very much leaning further forward. The hammer is dropping, the angle of her shoulders, her left shoulder's down more, and so that's going to tend to drag the hammer across her back into the next low point. With Lexi, much better position actually. This is a really good position. When we see a video shortly, you'll see that does deteriorate slightly, but then she is a novice, so it's a harder position to hold throughout all of the turns. Her weight is further back, and actually she's well extended and pointing towards the hammer. Both arms are now in really quite a reasonable position. So it just shows that beginners can hit this position, and hitting that now is absolutely the best time to learn it. So we do have a section in the document for overall, because clearly hammer is a throw overall, and what we're really interested in here, the biggest part of it, is the rhythm of the throw. What does that look like? You know, it should look like a decent throw, and if you go and watch enough throws, you soon get a sense of what the rhythm of a good hammer throw really does look like. The swings, in the swing phase, there is a rhythm to that. It should be, and it depends how many wind-ups your athlete does, winds around the head. 2 is often considered to be the ideal. The first swing is relatively slow and gets the hammer out and moving. The second swing is faster in order to accelerate it, ready for entry. The orbit, so the path that the hammer follows all the way through the throw, should grow, and there's a real sense of it getting bigger. And in fact, actually, in that other document I was referring to earlier, that was put out by one of the international bodies, they've shown the timing on there, the actual position of the hammer and so on. It actually does grow. The orbit gets bigger. The athlete is accelerating to some degree, but the fact that the orbit is widening and growing means that the actual effective head speed for the hammer goes up even more. The low point should move in equal steps in each turn. So what we mean by this is at the point wherever the low point is, and for some athletes it will start slightly on their right and then move across as they go through each turn, and we hope it doesn't get much past the center. It may, certainly by the time of the last turn, it can be out left of center from their perspective, a little bit around 200-degree mark away from the direction of the throw, and that's fine. It's not an issue, but it should look fairly even steps. If you see a big move in turn 1 and then 3 small turns of something going wrong in there, or vice versa, whatever it is, if the hammer either stays in roughly the same place, or just moves in equal steps, small amounts, then that's absolutely fine. The acceleration must be comfortable and consistent. So what we don't want to see is somebody who goes slow in turns 1, 2, and then suddenly beats the bits off it in turn 4. Again, inevitably, in order to do that, they get much more in a kind of a discus position, leading the implement, and that, despite all of the effort to turn, usually reduces the width of the orbit, and therefore all of the extra effort is wasted in terms of the loss of technique. Simply watching the throw, a good throw, feels powerful, and what I would recommend is, for those who haven't done it yet, if there are any, go watch as many throws as you can on the internet or in real life at competitions where decent people are throwing, and you will get this feeling that somehow there's a massive amount of power in the throw, even though the athlete usually looks relaxed and unrushed throughout the course of the throw. So that's the detail of it. Plan here now for the last few minutes of this presentation is to look through 3 videos. The video 1 is of Koji, as I've said. It's the video I've been referring to, and it was filmed by Sean Pickering, and I'm using it with his kind permission. It was actually filmed, as you will see, with 2 cameras and synchronized from the side and the back, which is very useful. Something that you can do relatively easy with just a couple of webcams and some free software off the internet. So something well worth thinking about for coaches. Second video, as I've said, Lucy, it was from 2016. She'd already got 20 years training experience, but some of what we've been talking about already is things that she developed over the early stage of her career, which I'm also responsible for, because I was a coach then, but actually, that was the very beginning of my coaching experience too. It's a 59-meter competitive throw. It was filmed by me, and Lucy has given me permission to use it. And then Lexi, she is a novice thrower. She's 14 years old. She's been throwing hammer for a year. It's a training throw. And as I've said, she's coached by Nick, who's online with us, and it was filmed by him and with Lexi's kind permission. So the first throw then we will look at here is Koji's, and my plan is just to run this through for you. I'm glad to see it's running nice and quickly this evening. If you look for all of those points that we have talked about during the rest of the presentation, there are a number of style things here. If you watch Koji, he steps back, steps in, and actually lands on the heel of his right foot in the toe turn. Again, we haven't taken anything specific about that, simply because it is a style thing. There are reasons for doing it. It suits him, it works for him. There are many other throws it works for too. Some it doesn't. So we very much look at that as a style issue rather than you must do this in your technique. There are some nations where they absolutely insist on it. In fact, I can't remember which ones off the top of my head, but there are some. So if I just slow that down, I'll stop it and move it through. You can see all of the positions as they are hit. In the swing, his arms go out, his hands stay close to his head. He's got his arms, if you look at the right hand one here, you can see just how far out he's already got the hammer in that. So, you would see that and you were looking at it using the document. That would give you a very good indication of how well connected he is to the hammer at that stage. Here we see the sit. He's now fixed his left hip, that right hip stays back, and he goes through the low point. There's the point that we're talking about. There's the next frame. That's why we couldn't use that one. But you'll see now he's absolutely looking at the hammer and he follows it all the way through. Oh, a little too far there. Into the wide point. Up into the high point, and here the hammer is really holding him. If you look at the right hand image again, you can see how well balanced he is. He's, the hammer's holding him in that position, and that means that it's as far out as it can be. It's very long. His arms are both absolutely bolt straight, and look at the position of that leg that he's ready to come down, and it's ready to go again into the next turn. If there's any point where he's actually ahead of the hammer in a way, if you look at it, what gets ahead is his hips momentarily, and it is as he moves into the catch. Now he is ever so slightly ahead, but what he is at that point then is incredibly patient, and it's a real skill to maintain patience whilst moving at the kind of speeds that are involved here. This isn't the actual full frame rate for this throw. It would be a little faster if seen even at proper full speed. There we go, through a low point and then actually into the delivery. Okay, so if we take that and move on to the next video. Here, this is the video of Lucy. I'll just turn off the wind noise. It was a windy day, I have to say. And you'll see what happens with Lucy here is that, as I said earlier, in the first turn, which was easier to identify in the static positions, she does overturn, she does lead the hammer, but in fact she is rather a strong athlete naturally, very strong in the lower back, and that allows her to correct it. So by the time she hits the third turn, she's actually going in the right direction, slap bang down the middle. You know, this is an error that's then corrected, and as it turned out, it was a decent throw. Throws in the end what pushed her over 60 and right on to where she is now at 63.5 meters is about correcting that. So she doesn't, correcting the beginning, so she doesn't have to put a correction in throughout the rest of the throw. Wherever you're correcting something, you're effectively wasting energy. You're potentially losing energy in the hammer, losing speed in the hammer, either through loss of width or loss of balance. So actually just being able to continually accelerate the hammer through good technique all the way through each turn, and Lucy obviously is a 3-turn thrower, not a 4, it's a very important aspect of the throw. So if we come back into the wind-up, you will see that Lucy does wind up relatively flat. She does even more so at the moment. When she gets the hammer behind her, well, here she's actually looking out to the right a little bit more, but of course she's in a slightly awkward position because her hips are very much facing the back. She's quite flexible in that way, so when you look at the difference between the angle between her shoulders and her hips, is almost 90 degrees in there with the hammer at full extension. Again, perhaps somebody with a stiffer back would find that much more difficult to do, so the issue of style comes back into it again at that point. When she comes round, going into the second wind, and she begins to accelerate it more, she does now tend to look more towards the back of the circle, and that's because she knows the extra speed's there. She begins to anticipate the turn, although she's sitting into it well. The right hip stayed back, but of course she's leaned forwards with her shoulders, and again, just it's one of those natural things with Lucy. She much prefer her weight on her toes than she does on her heels, so she does tend to try and get into that position without really thinking about it. When she sits on her heels, as she has done more recently, we see a significant increase in the speed of the hammer throughout all of the turns. There's that funny leg position in the catch. And as a consequence, Lucy has often got her weight too heavy on the right leg. And what that tends to result in is this. She begins to sit across onto her right leg. And actually, I think it happens. Yeah, it does. There it goes. If you watch her left foot, just try and take it back one frame. There we go. Just watch carefully. It moves, the whole heel moves. She pulls the left foot away, and I've heard questions about that recently. Why does that happen? And the simple answer is all Lucy's weight is currently on her right side. It's not on her left side at all. That left foot is not carrying any weight whatsoever. If it was, it wouldn't move. It's as simple as that. So she's allowed the weight to drift onto her right hand side, and that makes it difficult. However, as I've said, just by dint of her own athletic ability here, her strength, the fact that she's fast enough to do it in this mode, she is able to get herself back and down the middle of the sector. If we move on then to Lexi, and here we'll see this throw from her.
Whilst upright.
Again, you have to understand that Lexi is very early in her progress into using this part of the technique, particularly into throwing the hammer out to the left side.
Whilst upright.
So as a consequence, she tends to get dragged out that way. You can see what I mean about a bit more about the hip movement here, tending to move during the wind up, and a weight drifting over onto the left hand side results in her drifting over that way herself. Little issue with the video. Let's just see if I can just close one of the others, try and make that a little bit better. There we go. Just view that again.
Whilst upright.
Help.
Whilst upright.
Oh, sorry, let me just reload that. It's I'll just try and rerun that. Hopefully it might play a little bit better here. There we go. Right, so I think that looks a little bit better. Good. So what happens is that Lexi actually does throw the hammer out to her left side. She goes with it. She allows the ball to take control. She goes for that control imbalance, but she doesn't react to it later on. So in fact, in the later turns, we see she gets pulled over onto her left side. So in fact, the catch position now, and there's that funny knee, and she tends to get a little bit late with that, and that then, particularly in the last turn, means that she gets pulled away. Her weight is perhaps even too much on the left side eventually. There we go, and she actually gets pulled out over to the right. Okay, so those are the videos. Hopefully that was informative for you. If we look at the summary then, the excellence model is there as a tool to aid in the development of excellent technique and to build that sound basic model that we hope will lead towards world-class standard. The underlying ethos of achieving maximal speed of release must be considered all times. So, you know, there is no point in doing something that's really good in technique, but actually ends up in a slower release velocity. Again, you know, listening to Tor recently talking about how he coaches, and whilst I can't endorse this for reasons that will probably be obvious, he stands out in the field and watches his athletes throw. And, you know, they talk about technical changes, and if a technical change results in the hammer actually going significantly less, well, no matter how good it looks, if that remains the case, what's the point? So, you know, the aim is to actually look at the changes they try and make. They do give changes a lot of time to bed in. You know, there's no good in making a change and then saying, oh, I've tried 2 throws, it didn't work. That doesn't work very well. You're just going to end up changing and changing and changing and changing for change's sake, in effect. So the underlying ethos of achieving maximal speed of release must be considered at all time. And the underlying principles of athletic posture and linear drive must be understood in order really to understand the document and what it's trying to achieve. The model is a guide for those positions and must be understood to be part of an overall dynamic throw with good rhythm. So, you know, this is where the style of both the athlete and the coach can allow for different elements of how those positions are achieved, rather than saying, you know, you must do it this way. There are many roads to Rome, and this is no exception in that regard. So I hope that's been useful. And what we can look at now is for me to answer all of those questions. I've seen quite a few questions coming in there. So hopefully we'll shift back to Nick and he can be MC for those.
Okay, so you mentioned about software you can have video and athletes from two different directions, so you can compare the video. So can you remember what that is, or is there anybody within the group that knows what that is? If not, I'll pick this up later on. I maybe have a chat with Sean, although Sean was on the was dialed in earlier on. But yeah, if anyone, Gary, do you know? If not, does anyone in the group know?
I told you earlier, my memory for names is terrible, and I know it's a piece of software. I've actually downloaded it myself. Unfortunately, I can't refer to it right now, otherwise I'd tell you. But it was essentially used for golfing in the first places. But if you've got all of the equipment that goes with it, and Sean has got a great deal of that, you can actually analyse how far a throw should go and the angle of release and all of that along with it. As well as this basic function of being able to view from two, or I think you can even do it from three different angles if you really want to go for it.
The one I've seen Sean doing recently is Flight Scope.
That's the one. Thank you. Spot on. Yep.
Flight Scope. Yeah. Okay.
There is. I think there's a paid version, and I think there's a freebie version that just allows you to do the basic stuff.
So, question from Christopher: if the body is twisted on the turn as opposed to asymmetrical, does this not create drag, thus losing turn speed? So I think it's reference to Lucy's video.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's essentially what I'm saying, is that when Lucy turns and twists the head of the ball, she reduces the radius of her orbit, and that in effect reduces speed. Also, when she sticks her backside out, I mean, inevitably she's increasing the moment of inertia of her whole body, which is what she's doing to balance the throw, but that makes turning more difficult. So she ends up fighting herself in order to turn. Like I said, Lucy's a strong athlete, and I don't necessarily mean she lifts a lot, although she's not bad at that at all. But she is just naturally very strong. She does very little weight training, relatively speaking, compared to many, and yet she's just able to manage these positions because of that gross. Well, I guess some people call it farmer strength. It's just that natural ability, and therefore she does get away with things that other people don't. So yeah, and I frequently get other coaches come up to me and say, should she do this or that and the other? And often my answer is yes. If only you can persuade her to do it for me, I'll be very pleased.
And then a question from Graham. So I think you mentioned Tor, so it's Tor Gustafsson, but he's not Norwegian, is he? Is he?
No. No. Good question. I don't know what is. So Tor is spelled Tore, and it's Gustafsson, Gustaf. I think it's almost exactly as it sounds. Yeah, I've lost my track now, but so it is. I mean, Tor was a very long thrower as well. It's amazing, actually, when he demonstrates and is coaching, he always looks at it right-handed, but he was actually a left-handed thrower himself. So if you do go and look him up on YouTube, and you will see there are videos there of him throwing, his technique was very good. He was very, very good friends, as I understand it, with Koji, and the two of them worked together a fair bit on how they developed the throw for themselves. And although obviously they were going in opposite directions, there was a lot of similarity in that, particularly at certain times during their careers. That's it. Yes, that would make sense.
Okay, so any more questions coming in from anybody? I know there's a few people dropped off already because they've got other meetings and other webinars and things like that. But if anyone's got any questions that they want to chuck in the chat box, go for it. If you do need to go, that you'll get sent some feedback. So please fill that in as candidly as you can, and we will take it on board and try and develop what we're doing.
Yeah, we're very interested in feedback on the excellence model. As I've said, it's not meant to be a fixed item. It is meant to be a living document. So we do want to develop it. we want to use it as the underlying basis of discussions around the community of practice. And whilst initially the community of practice, there we go, thank you. John, you're doing very well for me. And whilst, you know, we're using it as the basis of that community of practice, which is initially mainly the coaches from the talent event programs. We will be looking to extend that, and if other people are interested and active in terms of what they'd like to contribute in those sessions, I'd be only too happy to add you in. So again, please feel free to contact me, and I will add you into those discussions.